You're listening in on an animated discussion about Superman the Animated Series with two experts in their fields. I'm Joshua Unruh, superhero scholar.
And I'm Caleb Masters, your friendly neighborhood film critic extraordinaire from the Cinematropolis.com. And today's topic is identity crisis. Oh, Joshua, this is, you could say this episode's a little bizarre. Oh.
Yeah, you could absolutely say that it's a twisted reflection of what we would normally get.
Oh, yes. Man, I can see the tomatoes coming through the virtual recording screen right now. The puns.
Well, you know, what are you going to do? It's a Bizarro episode. We have to acknowledge the fact that some of this stuff is going on. I mean, you know, and going on pretty well, I think, largely. This is a pretty interesting take on Bizarro, I feel.
So, Joshua, I'm just going to start off, and I know we're going to get into the character designs and all that here in a minute, but I have to say, Bizarro, I am not going to do the no pun intended thing. Bizarro is just for me, has always been such a strange character because the premise of the character is great. It's like it's a clone of Superman that's built by Lex Luthor. That's great. And I also like that the clone is he's not right. Like, that's super cool. What I find weird about Bizarro, and sometimes I love it and sometimes I hate it, is like the backwards speak, the kind of silliness of it. It's such a weird thing. And obviously that's the point of the character, but every time I watch him, I'm like, I can't decide if I love Bizarro or hate Bizarro because I roll my eyes a lot, but I also laugh a lot. So, you know.
No, buddy. I think you're onto something there. And while this technically isn't the visual design, right, I do think that this is part of a design conversation for the character, because I think what you're seeing is the friction between the original Silver Age version of Bizarro and the more modern tragic take that they're trying to do in this show, right? So for those of you at home who don't know, and you know, probably Caleb also, because Caleb does not strike me as the kind of person who read quite as many Silver Age Superman comic books as I have.
Sure didn't, Joshua.
Bizarro originally showed up, and this is kind of cool actually, in 1958, and almost simultaneously in the Superboy comic and the Superman newspaper strip, which were not handled by the same person. So there's some kind of like interesting behind the scenes of who came up with the idea first and who appropriated it, you know, for the other thing. But that's 1958. This is still deep in the Silver Age, where most Superman stories were very much weird fairy tale things more than they were superhero stories. I mean, you had villains show up and stuff like that, but this is the time I've mentioned before. This would be the era when Mort Weisinger, the editor-in-chief of all Superman for decades, came in with his dream journal and said, here, turn these into Superman stories. You know, that's a possibly apocryphal story, but it is also one I really like because it truly explains some of the weirdness. And when you look at something like Bizarro, who was very much played to be frustrating for Superman, but not really a threat, and mostly for laughs for the kids that were reading. So you have him being very much the mirror image of Superman. He is the reverse of Superman, but not in the way that somebody like Ultraman is, where good is evil and evil is good. With Bizarro, good is bad and bad is good, if you can understand, you know, the kind of the shades there. So beauty is ugly, ugly is beautiful. He talks a little sideways, you know, me am Bizarro, me am ugly, but he means that in a good way. And it was meant to be very comical. Like, it was supposed to be the kind of thing that would make, you know, 8, 9, 10-year-olds laugh. You go into the 90s and they want to do, and I think largely do a good job of it, but they want to do a much more tragic or pathos-filled version of the character, which we are going to see even stronger when he reappears. You know, we're going to see that even more tragic in the next appearance. But yeah, I think you're seeing the friction between the original concept and what they're trying to adapt it into, which is a much more, I think, Frankenstein's monster approach.
Yeah.
Or even there, it's like a hybrid between the pop cultural view of Frankenstein's monster and the actual novel view. They're just doing a lot of things, and you're feeling where the edges don't quite match up.
Yeah, see, but it's like Frankenstein's monster from the Gene Wilder musical, though. Like it's got like the goofiness there.
Sometimes, right?
Yeah, no, I really like it. And here's, I just think on paper, the thing I really like about it, about Bizarro as a character. Okay, so without getting too in the weeds, I come from an evangelical background, not really there anymore in any way. Here's why I'm saying this. I always grew up thinking of Superman in terms of like this very theological perspective. Again, not so much anymore, but the thing I found fascinating about Bizarro is if Superman was supposed to be this like Christ Messiah figure, which I think is somewhat rooted in the character's history, somewhat.
It's definitely where he evolved after a lot of his original Jewish creators faded out.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So if you're thinking about him that way, and you're thinking about Lex Luthor as mankind, especially like the ego of man, this man who really thinks of himself as a god, as a multi-billionaire CEO of a company, thinking himself as a god. Who knew? If you think about that, I do love the kind of like thematic through line that Superman just is Superman. He just is this sort of like messianic type figure. And the best Lex Luthor can do is when trying to create his own Messiah type figure is Bizarro. And I think there's some I love it because it's a little ironic, and it just shows how no matter how many resources or wits or science that Lex Luthor can muster, his best creation is just still a very poor imitation.
No, I think that largely that's a really interesting take. This is probably not the episode for it, but there is like a really absolutely fascinating conversation to be had about Superman as judge, as an Old Testament judge, or even lawgiver like Moses under his Jewish creators, that then transitions into a much more traditionally Christian Messiah, up through All-Star Superman, where Grant Morrison is actually doing... He has said out loud, he is actually doing the kind of more traditional, or I guess not traditional as much as pagan, for lack of a better phrase, pagan dying and resurrecting God, like sun god myth. Like that's a thing that crops up in several, the sun sets and comes back. It becomes a dying and resurrecting God in a lot of ancient cultures. And he's doing that very specifically with Superman, but even in All-Star. But even then, that winds up going through a very Jesus Christ lens, because it's, he's a modern person writing it, even if he's going back to that well. And in the terms of that, Luthor as a very, and boy, I'm going to start sounding like a pretentious literary guy at this point, but Lex Luthor as an extremely Miltonian Satan, I would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven.
Right.
Kind of figure. Yeah. When he creates a version of Superman, it's not quite right. But, and I mean, boy, are we jumping into the meat of this episode, but that's fine. My favorite part of that take is that even though he creates a twisted version, he cannot create an evil version of Superman. It's not... Bizarro does not understand exactly what he's doing or why he's doing it all the time, but he's not doing evil things. He's just confused. And in the end, his heart is good and pure just by being more or less told to be like Superman. In the clutch, he really is like Superman. It's fantastic. I think, again, you're 100% onto something.
Well, and then I would also, the thing I'd add on there is that Superman, I mean, once he discovers what's actually going on, he's like, oh, this is not someone pertaining to me. This like Bizarro actually thinks he's me. He just needs guidance.
Yes.
And instead of like trying to like beat him up, he's like, no, Bizarro, you can help. You're good. You can do what I do. Just act like me, or whatever I mean. Like he inspires Bizarro to become good. So again, Superman sort of like leading with empathy, which again is something that, in my opinion, is very essential to the core of who Superman is. Sort of trying to lead this character to a certain redemption arc, I just found really particularly powerful. So yeah, anyway, we jumped right into the meat of the episode. I have a further Lex Luthor analysis through that lens that we'll save for another day. But I think as it relates to Bizarro, the idea that yes, Lex cannot actually create a Messiah, and also that creation still gets sort of the blank slate, the tabula rasa thing. Yeah, I'm talking like I'm a freshman undergrad out of a philosophy and ethics class. But the idea that this creation still has a chance to be good or evil, and then at the end of the episode chooses to be good, speaks well of Bizarro as a character and what makes him interesting. Right? He's almost like a baby almost.
No, the tabula rasa is really interesting because you're right. Like right out of the tube. We don't see this, obviously, but right out of the tube, it seems fairly clear he could have gone either way, right? Mm-hmm. But because Lex is trying to make his own Superman, he wants Superman, but a Superman he can control. So he convinces the being that will be Bizarro that he is Superman. And that level of programming, like how deep could it be from Lex's perspective? Not very deep, right? I mean, it might have just been sort of programming him with like a video interviews, just, making them Clockwork Orange style, watch video interviews and be like, you're Superman, watch this thing. And how does Bizarro come out of that? He comes out of it good. Mm-hmm. So good that he squares off against Lex, which is just, I mean, when Lex starts talking about this as a failed experiment, this is very subtextual, but I'm imagining he means it on a variety of levels. Oh, yeah. Like not only did the cloning not go well, but I wanted him to be my Superman. That's a failed idea too, because even if he didn't consciously think this, Lex has got to realize when I create a Superman, I have created another enemy for myself. Mm-hmm. So what I really want is someone with the powers of Superman and nothing else connected to Superman, It is a little bit like your freshman philosophy class or whatever, but this is one of the reasons that I really appreciate superhero fiction as a whole, is that when we turn these internal struggles into metaphors that we can externalize and then punch or laser face or have a philosophical conversation with or whatever, that's good, actually. That is a good way to start these conversations. I would say with kids or young adults, but I would say even with adults. My co-host for Listen Up A-Holes, my MCU podcast, Lonnie Diane Rich, she says a lot. Story's the most powerful force in the universe. And part of that is it lets us process things that might otherwise be too close to us personally to process or just too big an idea to process. When we can do it through a story, it's extremely powerful. It's no longer an intellectual discussion. You've brought it into your heart because it's characters that you're identifying with. Anyway, I'll take a deep breath now. I just don't think we need to apologize for any of that because that's all here. All of that is here. And it's what makes Superman a character that endures other than the fact that copyright exists and Warner Brothers just wants to make money. It's both of those things.
100%. Superman represents a lot more than just the dollars and cents or the hand-fisty action or the director recuts of movies. He is so much bigger than that, or black suits. But Joshua, let's step back here. I have more to say, but I do not want us to slide by the character designs. So if you could,
there's an actual look to him. Yes, absolutely. So it's very different from his traditional comic book look. His comic book look was very much still the chalk white skin, but he almost looked badly chiseled from stone, right? Like there was a lot of hard edges, right? This is, I feel, going, like I said, for a much more Frankenstein's monster approach to Superman. We take Superman's broad shoulders and turn him into kind of more of a hunch. He's often standing very, I don't know a better term for this. The only way I've ever heard it is pigeon-toed. That's probably not the best way to say it, but I don't know another way. He's always standing toes pointed in. He's very awkward, very lumbering, and lumbering with Superman's power is scary, right? Like a toddler or somebody with the mental ability of a toddler with that level of power is scary. Even as you realize that he's not trying to be. That almost makes it worse in a way. That brings that tragedy. So anyway, I think it's a really good look.
It's almost like, have you ever seen a kid like play with the toys in a very somewhat destructive way? That's kind of what it's like, right? You're like, ooh, if you put that in the real world, that's kind of scary.
So I really like the Frankenstein's monster approach. I really like the off-brand colors that his costume changes into. I will say that one aspect of the old Bizarro that I miss here, and there's not really an explanation for how this could have happened in this episode. I'm just being honest. It's a thing that exists in my head, and I'm sad that it didn't make it in here somehow, is the S backwards. Like it gets messed up on his costume, but in the, the old school Bizarro, the S was just flipped. Again, because he's a mirror image. And I think that that's one of the cool things you can do with an icon as recognizable as Superman's symbol, right? When you flip it, we automatically know that means something, right? Ultraman's U is actually in the same diamond shape, but upside down. We know what that means. The unknown Superman in All-Star Superman has the exact same symbol, but the S becomes a question mark.
Right.
And at the end, when they're talking about making a new Superman, it's a 2. I mean, when you have an icon that recognizable, I just feel like there's a lot of interesting things you can do with it. And I don't know how they would have explained a backwards S in this episode, but I admit that I miss it.
Well, Joshua, I'm really glad you mentioned that, and I did think that would have been a nice touch. However, I will say I'm glad they at least started the episode with the original S design, because I will tell you right now, I forgot what this episode was about when I turned it on. I didn't realize this was the Bizarro episode, so I actually found this opening to be super cool. It was a cool bait and switch. When you saw Superman flying around and then you see Clark Kent with Lois Lane in the car, I was like, wait. It took me a second, and then I was like, oh, light bulb, this is Bizarro. But I genuinely forgot. I'd seen this episode a couple times before. Totally forgot this is how it opened. I thought this was a really, really awesome opening. I everything down to the whole like make good decisions, like joke. I was like, yeah,
with the kids.
He's being Superman, and then I was like, oh, so what a great opening. Just a great mislead.
Absolutely.
And a great like way to quickly establish the mystery. Of course, we get the mystery solved pretty quickly, but there was a moment where if I was watching this the first time, I would have been like, what is going on here? So I just get great storytelling, at least from like a purely like execution standpoint, rolling that out to the audience and kind of posing like a lot of questions to set up a really interesting episode. Great work there.
Yeah, no, I agree. That reveal is legitimately great. And it actually sets me up personally to see a few other really clever choices that they make. Like I thought it was really interesting that Mercy names Bizarro as kind of a cracked mirror version of Lois naming Superman. Mm-hmm. Like that level of stuff is really, I don't know. There's a lot of really clever things in what on the surface looks like a pretty relatively simple episode.
Right? Yeah, the parallels, and what's funny is like I don't feel like these are all immediately obvious again, which just speaks to how well I think this episode was done. I also really enjoyed the fact that we really are still starting to get into the more world building phase of the DCAU, because I mean we're sitting here, they reference that the blood was taken from the museum in season 1, which it was a specific reference to a little piece of home in season 1. Then we're full ahead in season 2 at this point. So I just think it's really cool that they're making allusions. Yeah, I remember that time that happened. And that was also the introduction. That same episode was the introduction of Kryptonite. So we're starting to. We've already talked about this, about how the new Batman Adventures has definitely been playing with that a little bit. Superman's playing with it a little bit, and we're going to start to see that payoff, especially when we get to Batman Begins and then Justice League, of course. So just really clever, great reference. Didn't really add anything to the episode per se, other than you're like, oh, they're saying these are connected. That's cool.
Yes. It's continuity working for the story instead of against the story, like way too often, especially in superhero works now in the comics. And we might be getting to this place with some of the live action offerings as well, that continuity starts to become a weight that you're dragging around instead of a thing that can facilitate new stories. I don't think anybody had A Little Piece of Home in mind as a vehicle for Bizarro when they wrote A Little Piece of Home. I mean, maybe somebody had like one line in their notebook or something like that, but it wasn't like a fully fleshed out thought. And then when they start sitting in the writer's room, they're like, how are we going to get Bizarro? Well, Lex needs to get some blood. Well, when could that have happened? And it just becomes this way to go forward with something that happened before in a way that makes the world feel more rich. It adds depth, and that is good. I like it.
Yeah, most definitely. And I mean, that is something that, again, we will see pay off. The longer the DCAU goes on, the more we see that payoff with a variety of different characters. And there's one example in particular than Justice League we'll get to at some point. But I just remember there's a couple moments where you're like, wow, they didn't plan this episode 10 years ago, but holy cow, that shoe fits really well. So anyway, just want to applaud the work here, because at this point in time, this really hadn't been done on television, at least with superheroes at this point in time in the 90s.
No, really, you started to get some extremely convoluted superhero approaches. Your mileage may vary on the 90s Spider-Man cartoon. The animation's kind of rough. It's not always like the best to watch, but they went hard for the really like weirder, obscure Spider-Man continuity, and not always in a way that worked, and I felt the same way about the 90s X-Men cartoon. Like, they never shied away from how weird the X-Men were, but also sometimes maybe a couple more lines of explanation would have been good, as opposed to this very subtle, like, slow build. I appreciate both approaches, but yeah, it's really interesting to even then, 25, 30 years ago, see how different the DC and Marvel approaches are in their adaptation works.
Right. When I seriously, Joshua, I really wonder, and maybe it's just, I wonder a lot of times, did Kevin Feige actually take a lot of notes from the DCAU, because the approaches are extremely similar, and how the MCU worked out. So anyway, just notable observation there.
I have another place that I think this show is learning from its own mistakes.
Yeah.
So here we have a couple of set pieces that are battles between essentially two Kryptonians, right? In Superman and Bizarro. And how much more interesting are these set pieces compared to the last time Superman was fighting two Kryptonians? Like, we complained about blasts from the past just being visually boring. Yeah. And here we have, half the time they're not even fights. They're just like the big destructive things that are able to happen with these powers. And I just really feel like this is such a better example of that. I really appreciate the effort that they put into both thinking about what Bizarro would do, fixing things that aren't broken, saving condemned buildings, and the way that Superman has to respond to that is such a massive, just quantum leap in quality, I think, from the beginning of this season.
Well, it's just they thought through it more interesting. They're like, what would Bizarro do? Or how could we utilize how this guy's kind of dumb or has not a fully developed brain? Like, how can we utilize that character in a fight? And it just really comes together in a way that's just way more interesting than what we saw with Blast for the Past, where it just felt like, okay, super people flying around the sky punching each other. Sometimes they'll knock over a building, but this was way more interesting for my money as well. I agree. I also want to note, Joshua, we've got to do our superpower level, Superman power level check-in. And this week is actually, I guess it's sort of a spoiler because, like you referenced at the beginning of the episode today, Bizarro, he comes back. So I will say that my Superman power level check-in is that Bizarro survives a 0.5 kiloton blast that looks like a nuke went off. He apparently survives. That's pretty powerful if you ask me. I don't know too many other superheroes who could survive a 0.5 kiloton blast. I don't know what a 0.5 kiloton blast is, but it looked pretty big.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's and I really like that they lampshade that a little bit at the end when Lois is like, do you think he survived? And Superman, because again, this is still a relatively early, it's second season, but a relatively early in his career, Superman's like, I don't know, I've never been in a 0.5 kiloton blast. I'm not sure. That's the only way he would know. And it's not like he's going to go out and blow himself up with bigger and bigger things just to find out where the limit is. But he just admits, I don't know. That's so good. It's very good.
Yeah.
But you and I know. We know.
we know he survives. So I think, Joshua, the last thing I have that I want to note on here, and I actually don't want to spend too much time on this, but it relates to a couple of my thoughts here. I've already mentioned, I think ad nauseum, probably a couple times, just the things that were in the zeitgeist of pop culture in the 90s.
Yeah.
Obsession of cloning, I've mentioned before, which is very on point, on display here. The reason I mention this is because that at the end, when they're torching the other clones, for animation, it's okay. Like, I don't think it's going to spook kids, but if you were to do that in live action, what they were showing was mortifying. Like
Yes.
partially developed bodies just laying everywhere. I was like, holy cow, this is disturbing. Wow. And again, you'll see with my alternate media recommendation, like exactly how gruesome that can look at like when realized live action. But I'm like, wow, I can't believe they did this on a children's show sort of things. It only works because they could like simplify the animation.
No, I agree. It is absolutely a thing that works really well in terms of this show. But they also don't really focus either kind of the script or any of the shots on the horror that could have been happening in that scene. And really, there's an ethical horror there, too, where Lex is just like, well, this is a failed experiment. Are they living beings? I don't care. Boom. You know, I mean, there's a whole conversation. We could have had an entire conversation in this episode about the viability of these beings. It's not what this episode is about, so we just cruise past it. But there it sits in the background going, hello, I'm a giant horror show and also an ethical consideration. It's amazing.
It's terrifying. And yeah, I guess if anything, it underscores, you're right, it totally underscores even further how evil Lex is and how he just does not, he doesn't care. He doesn't think about that. His ego is so massive that he is, all of that is beneath him. Are those things living? Yes. He doesn't even think to ask the question, really. It just, Lex is a monster. I think he's one of my favorite villains of all time. And it's terrible. And it's gross for kids. But, kids hadn't seen other horror movies yet.
So, Caleb, you mentioned specifically that your alternate media recommendation will look more closely at this, late 90s fascination with cloning, but in a much more like horror movie kind of way. Tell me a little bit about your alternate media rec.
Okay, so here's what I'm going to say. I'm just going to preface this by saying I'm not going to argue this is a great movie or even a good movie. What I am going to say is it's an interesting movie, a truly interesting movie, and that it's really weird and it asks lots of questions, and I don't know if it delivers satisfying answers, but there they are. And also, the creature designs are terrifying, period. And I am recommending Alien Resurrection. That is the fourth movie in the Alien franchise. And of course, I'm referring to the 1979 Alien movie directed by Ridley Scott, followed by James Cameron's Aliens in the 80s. And then we don't really talk about David Fincher's Alien 3, even though I think it's a misunderstood film. We're talking about the fourth one, Alien Resurrection, which actually came out just 3 months after this episode aired. So again, clones and ethics of cloning was super in the zeitgeist. Okay, this movie, Alien movie, is all very gory. This one, extremely gory. They deal with cloning because essentially, spoilers, the Ellen Ripley, played by Sigourney Weaver, in this particular movie is a clone. Again, this is in the opening of the movie, so it's not really that big of a spoiler.
Yeah, not much of a spoiler.
Right. And anyway, I'm not going to get into details, but yes, she is a clone. Where they also used some of the alien xenomorph DNA to bring her to life. Well, I want to say it's around halfway, maybe a little over halfway through the movie. She walks into the lab where all the failed clones of her are, and holy moly, people, this is nightmare fuel. She's got like bodies and tubes that are like somewhat humanoid, very alienish. She's got like xenomorph heads on her body, and then she's like the intestines laying around everywhere. And and there's like a version of her that's on a table and it's like, kill me. It's horrific. But man, for that moment alone, again, I don't know if it's a good movie, but it's one that I'll always remember and will recommend to people who are into that sort of thing. So Alien Resurrection, 1997, just 3 months after this episode aired. Joshua, what about you? What alternate media recommendations do you have for us today?
I am also going to take you back to the 90s, to the halcyon days 1992. for Sam Raimi's third Evil Dead film, Army of Darkness. And here is why. For those of you who have not had the joy of Raimi's various Evil Dead films, what are you doing with your life? But this was actually, because I wasn't much of a horror guy when I was a kid, right? This was actually my first brush with the Evil Dead franchise, which is, I don't know. I have mixed feelings about this as my entry, but still, it's a little sillier than some of the other offerings in the series. A lot sillier in some cases. But the reason that I thought of it specifically for Bizarro is that our hero, played by Bruce Campbell, Ash is sent back to the medieval times to fight zombies, and while he's there, an evil version of him is created. So you get to watch Bruce Campbell play this real square-jawed heroic version of himself and also this very evil version of himself. But the thing that made me think of Bizarro is that Ash is a very three-quarters competent hero, which means that his evil version is a three-quarters competent bad guy. And it feels very Bizarro with a more humorous angle than tragic or full of pathos. So that's my rec. 1992's Army of Darkness. Get on that jazz.
Seriously, people, get on Army of Darkness if you haven't watched it. Maybe, see, this could be a double feature, actually. You get mortified by Alien Resurrection, and then to shrug it off, you just turn on Army of Darkness, which is only like around 90 to 100 minutes long, not super long, and you got lots of laugh, and both of them provide the strongest, a couple of the strongest things about this episode wrapped into two different movies. So check it out, listeners. Great recommends.
That about wraps it up for this animated discussion. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to join in, come find us on Twitter. Caleb is at CMastersTalk, and I'm at Joshua Unruh, and the hashtag is Animated Discussion. Caleb, where else can people find you?
Well, Joshua, I'm the editor-in-chief and a contributor at the Cinematropolis, a website that specializes in in-depth film critique and analysis. We also publish in-depth essays on all types of different films. You can find all of those articles at thecinematropolis.com. I do want to plug that we are in the middle of a special interview series on our podcast, The Cinematic Schematic, where we're talking to a variety of people working in various aspects of the film industry about how 2020 impacted the way that they worked, and also the three films that helped them get through it all.
Remember that an animated discussion is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, check out patreon.com/pulpdictionproductions. Show your support by pledging at Patreon or by leaving a great review on Apple Podcasts to make it easier for more people to find us and join in the discussion.
And of course, the links to Patreon, Apple Podcasts, our recommendations, and Twitter are all very easy to find in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us for this animated discussion. We'll be back next time to talk about the new Batman Adventures episode, Cult of the Cat.
Until next time, look! Up in the sky! It's a bird! It's a plane! It's an animated discussion!